On Christmas Eve, my husband sat across from me at the desk in our home office and said, in a calm, almost courteous tone, "You will apologize to her tonight, or you will lose your salary and your promotion." There was no yelling, no visible anger, only certainty. Between us rested a single sheet of paper, a formal internal notice with my name typed cleanly at the top. Salary suspension, promotion delayed, review pending for professional misconduct. It lay there like a sentence that had already been passed. I looked at him and understood something deeply unsettling. This was no longer my husband speaking to me. This was a chief executive evaluating risk and deciding what needed to be removed. I asked the question anyway. "And if I don't?" He didn't pause. "Then this becomes very difficult for you, Eliza. You don't want that." Outside the window, snow drifted gently over Manhattan. Downstairs, our Christmas party was already in full swing. Laughter, music, champagne, people celebrating a company they believed in, completely unaware of what was happening upstairs. The woman he wanted me to apologize to was Malene Rhodes, his newest favored executive, younger, flashier, and yes, the woman he had been sleeping with. He framed it as professionalism, as teamwork, as my inability to be collaborative. But I knew the reality. He wanted my obedience, publicly, in front of everyone. He wanted me to bend so he could shield her without consequences. I looked at the document again. 8 years of work, 8 years of building something real, reduced to a box to check and a signature to collect. Something inside me went very quiet. I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I didn't bargain. I said one word: "Okay." Relief passed across his face. He thought he had won. He believed that word meant submission. What he didn't know was that my suitcases were already loaded into the trunk of my car. He didn't know my transfer papers had already been approved. He didn't know that by morning I would be gone. That night he believed he had broken me. In truth, that was the moment I chose myself. Before I became the woman being threatened inside her own home, I was Eliza Warren, the person who helped build everything my husband now believed belonged to him. I came from science, not spectacle. Long hours in quiet laboratories, data that either stood up to scrutiny or didn't. No applause, no shortcuts, only discipline, patience, and accountability. In my field, when you are wrong, people pay the price, sometimes with their health, sometimes with their lives. I met Daniel when we were both young enough to believe that ambition and integrity could coexist without conflict. Back then, he was curious, engaging. He asked the kinds of questions most people skipped. He wanted to know how things worked, not just how they sold. When we married, we weren't chasing power, we were building something meaningful, or at least I was. I joined the company not as his wife, but as a strategist. I evaluated initiatives, I challenged assumptions, I protected the mission when doing so became inconvenient. While Daniel spoke to investors, I worked with researchers. While he gave interviews, I handled problems no one else wanted. For years, it worked. The company grew. Treatments reached patients who had been ignored by larger competitors. People trusted us because we didn't chase trends, we pursued results. Daniel liked to say we were a team, and for a long time I believed him. But the truth I avoided was this: I was building the foundation, and he was standing on top of it. Every promotion he received rested on work I had already done. Every confident decision he made had been quietly reviewed by me long before it reached a boardroom. I never needed recognition. I never sought applause. What I required was respect. Somewhere along the way, respect became optional, then inconvenient, then disposable. By the time I recognized it, Daniel no longer saw me as a partner. He saw me as an obstacle, and in his world, obstacles were meant to be managed or eliminated. Success didn't change Daniel overnight. It eroded him slowly, the way corrosion works: silent, gradual, easy to ignore until the damage is irreversible. First came the article praising his leadership, then another, then invitations to speak, to advise, to sit at tables where people discussed valuation instead of impact. He came home energized in a way I hadn't seen before, repeating phrases he'd picked up from investors: scale, efficiency, market dominance. At first, I listened. I asked questions. I reminded him why the company existed at all. He nodded, distracted, already several conversations ahead. That was when Malene Rhodes appeared. She arrived with flawless credentials and shallow answers, polished presentations, confident delivery, language that sounded impressive until you slowed it down and examined what it actually said. She spoke eloquently about growth, but vaguely about substance. Daniel was captivated. He called it a fresh perspective. I called it recycled ideas wrapped in confidence. My objections were no longer treated as insight. They were labeled resistance, negativity, an inability to evolve. Meetings began happening without me. Decisions were finalized before I ever saw the data. When I questioned assumptions, Daniel sighed, the way people do when facts feel inconvenient. "You're too focused on details," he said once. "You're missing the bigger picture." But I was the only one still looking at the entire picture. Malene learned quickly how to position herself. She agreed with Daniel in public and deferred in private. She praised his vision. She framed every disagreement as confusion rather than challenge. Slowly, I became the difficult one, the woman who asked uncomfortable questions, the wife who reminded him of principles he no longer wanted to defend, the voice that interrupted his momentum. I watched him stop listening. He stopped asking what I thought and began informing me of what he had decided. At home, the distance widened. Conversations shortened. Touch disappeared. He stopped seeing me as someone who understood him and started seeing me as someone who constrained him. That was when I understood something painful. Daniel didn't fall in love with Malene because she was better than me. He fell in love with her because she made him feel larger, without holding him accountable. And in his new world, accountability was the last thing he wanted. 4 months before that Christmas Eve, I returned home early from a conference. I had planned to surprise Daniel. I stopped at the grocery store and bought ingredients for a meal we used to cook together, back when we still moved in the same rhythm. I remember thinking that maybe things could still be repaired, that perhaps the distance had been imagined. I opened the door quietly, and then I heard her voice, clear, confident, comfortable, the sound of someone who believed she belonged there. I froze in the hallway and allowed my mind to do what it had always done best: observe, record, accept facts without emotion. Her shoes by the door, a glass on the table marked with lipstick that wasn't mine, his jacket tossed casually over a chair. I didn't go into the bedroom. I didn't confront them. I didn't collapse on the floor or scream or demand explanations that would insult my intelligence. I turned around and left. I drove to a hotel and sat in the bathroom for a long time, not crying, just breathing, letting the truth settle without resistance. In my line of work, when a compound shows toxicity, you don't spend years trying to justify it. You don't argue with reality. You end the trial. That night, I stopped believing in my marriage. But I didn't end it loudly. I didn't give Daniel the satisfaction of drama or tears or fury. I ended it the same way I ended anything that posed a risk to me: quietly, deliberately, with preparation. Because I understood something many people never do. The moment you confront someone who has already betrayed you, you give them time to prepare their defense, and I had no intention of warning him. I didn't ask Daniel for explanations. I didn't demand honesty from someone who had already proven he was comfortable with deception. Instead, I did what I always did when faced with a complex problem. I gathered information. I documented everything: decisions that strayed from company values, expenses that were poorly explained or not explained at all, proposals that looked impressive on the surface but collapsed under scrutiny, not for revenge, for protection. When power shifts, truth becomes dangerous to the wrong people. At the same time, I began building something separate. Months earlier, Daniel's father, Richard Warren, had mentioned expanding operations abroad, a European research hub, London, partnerships with institutions that still valued substance over spectacle. At the time, it had sounded like a distant possibility. Now, it became my lifeline. Richard had always seen the company differently than his son. Where Daniel saw growth charts, Richard saw patience. Where Daniel chased attention, Richard valued continuity. He noticed the shift long before I said a word. "You still remember why this company exists," he told me one evening, his voice heavy with disappointment that was not directed at me. I began working nights, quiet calls, careful introductions, conversations about science, not politics. I demonstrated value without announcing my intentions. I built trust where it still mattered. Daniel did not notice. He was busy with appearances, busy with Malene, busy believing he had already won. By the time he decided to turn corporate policy into a weapon against me, I had already created options he did not know existed. I had learned something crucial. People who rely on control assume no one else is planning. They mistake silence for compliance, calm for weakness, stillness for fear. They never imagine that the person standing quietly in front of them has already moved 3 steps ahead. By the time Daniel threatened my career, my future no longer depended on him. He just didn't know it yet. The board meeting happened the day before Christmas Eve. Malene stood at the front of the room, confident and polished, clicking through slides filled with bold arrows and ambitious projections. Her proposal was simple in theory and dangerous in practice. Redirect funding away from complex research and toward products that promised faster returns and louder headlines. She called it evolution. She called it modernization. I called it abandonment. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice. I did not attack her personally. I did not question her motives. I did what I had always done. I presented data. I explained what would happen if we shifted resources the way she proposed, which research teams would leave, which partnerships would dissolve, which patients would be forgotten because their conditions were no longer profitable enough to matter. I spoke slowly, clearly, with evidence she could not refute. The room went quiet. Richard Warren removed his glasses and looked at the board, not at his son. He thanked me. Then he tabled Malene's proposal indefinitely. The decision was unanimous. Malene's smile froze. She looked to Daniel, waiting for him to intervene. He said nothing. That silence told me everything. Later that night, Daniel accused me of humiliating her, of undermining leadership, of embarrassing him in front of his father. That was when I understood the real offense. I had not challenged bad strategy, I had exposed the wrong person. By defending the company's mission, I had threatened the fragile balance Daniel was trying to protect. Not the business, his relationship. The next evening, on Christmas Eve, he called me into the office and slid the personnel notice across the desk. "Apologize," he said, "or lose everything." What he did not understand was that the boardroom had already decided something important. They had chosen truth over performance. And once that happens, power begins to shift in ways no ultimatum can stop. The Christmas party downstairs looked like a celebration of certainty. Crystal glasses, soft music, executives laughing as if nothing in the world could touch them. Daniel moved through the room with Malene at his side, his hand resting lightly on her back, already behaving as if the future had been settled in his favor. He believed I would comply. He believed I would apologize quietly, smooth things over, and return to my place. He believed that power, once asserted, always worked. I stood near the windows and watched the snow fall over the city, feeling strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes when the decision has already been made and there's nothing left to fear. When Daniel approached me, his voice was low and controlled. He reminded me that everyone was waiting, that Mylene deserved respect, that I could end this easily. I nodded. Then I stepped forward. I did not raise my voice. I did not seek attention. I simply spoke clearly enough for the room to hear. I announced that I was resigning from my position, effective immediately. The laughter faded, conversations stalled, glasses paused midair. Before anyone could react, I continued. I explained that I had accepted a new role as managing director for the European division, overseeing expansion in London, that the decision had been approved by the board, that it would take effect at the start of the new year. Daniel stared at me as if I had spoken another language. He tried to interrupt. He said that position did not exist, that he had not approved anything. Richard stepped forward then. He confirmed everything. The room shifted. In that moment, Daniel understood what he had missed. While he was managing appearances, I had been building reality. While he was demanding obedience, I had been securing independence. Mylene did not look at me. She stared at the floor, already calculating her next move. I thanked the team, I wished them well, I offered a brief transition plan that I had already prepared. Then I walked away. No applause followed, no confrontation, just silence. That silence carried something far heavier than anger. It carried understanding. Daniel followed me to the door, his voice breaking for the first time that night. He said we needed to talk, that this was not how things were supposed to end. I turned back once. I told him that I had said okay earlier because I meant something very specific. I meant that I was done asking for permission to protect my own dignity. Then I left. By the time the door closed behind me, the party was still standing, but the illusion of control had already collapsed. And for the first time in years, I felt free. London did not feel like an escape, it felt like alignment. There was no dramatic arrival, no applause waiting at the airport, just a gray sky, a quiet car ride, and a small team that greeted me with something I had not felt in years. Professional respect, without conditions. My office was modest, functional, no glass walls designed to intimidate, no power games disguised as collaboration. People spoke plainly, they listened, they asked better questions. For the first time in a long time, I was not managing someone else's ego. I was doing real work again. The team did not care who my husband was or what had happened in New York. They cared whether I understood the science, whether I could make decisions, whether I showed up prepared. I did. Projects moved forward without politics slowing them down. Partnerships formed based on trust rather than image. Researchers spoke openly. Disagreements happened without punishment. I slept better. I breathed deeper. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, wondering how I could have phrased things differently to avoid conflict. There was nothing to avoid. I realized something uncomfortable but liberating. My marriage had trained me to minimize myself, to soften truths, to stay quiet when being right made someone else feel small. London required none of that. I did not have to earn my place every morning. I was simply allowed to take it. News from New York reached me slowly, carefully filtered through professional updates and quiet messages from people who stayed in touch. The company felt unstable, morale was slipping, key researchers were leaving. I felt no satisfaction in that, only clarity. I had not been the problem. I had been the structure holding everything together, and once I stepped away, the cracks became visible to everyone else. Some nights, walking home through streets that did not know my history, I felt something close to gratitude, not for what I lost, but for what I had stopped trying to save. London gave me space, purpose, peace, and with that distance, I finally understood the truth. Leaving was not a failure. Staying would have been. I did not watch New York closely at first. I was busy building something that required my full attention, but eventually the updates became impossible to ignore. Projects stalled, timelines slipped. People I had worked with for years began quietly reaching out, asking questions they were not supposed to ask. The tone was careful, concerned, uncertain. Daniel tried to push forward as if nothing had changed. He approved decisions faster. He leaned harder on Maylene. He spoke louder in meetings, as if volume could replace judgment. It did not work. Without someone asking hard questions, small mistakes multiplied. Proposals that should have been challenged went through unexamined. Research teams began to leave, citing culture, not compensation. The company did not collapse overnight. It weakened gradually, the way systems do when the structure beneath them is removed. Then came the investigation. Expense reviews, ethics inquiries, questions Daniel had always avoided suddenly demanded answers. He was no longer protected by confidence or charisma. He was measured by records. Maylene disappeared first. Officially, it was a strategic transition. Unofficially, everyone understood. She had aligned herself with power, not substance, and when that power faltered, she moved on. Daniel lasted longer. Pride will do that, but eventually even pride runs out of leverage. When he stepped down, the announcement was brief, polished language, no accusations, no explanations, just the quiet end of something that had already been broken for a long time. People asked how I felt about it. I told them the truth. I did not destroy anyone. I simply stopped holding everything together for people who never noticed the weight I was carrying. That was not revenge. That was consequence. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. No dramatic envelope, no urgent tone, just a familiar name in the corner that made my chest tighten before I even opened it. Richard Warren had passed away quietly in his sleep. I sat at my desk in London for a long time after reading those words. He had been the last person in that family who saw me clearly, not as an extension of his son, not as a threat, but as someone who understood the responsibility of building something that mattered. A week later, another letter arrived. This one was addressed to me personally. Richard wrote with the same clarity he had always spoken with. He thanked me for protecting the company when it became inconvenient, for refusing to compromise values, for comfort, for walking away without trying to burn anything down. Then came the part that stopped me cold. He had left me voting shares, enough to matter, enough to give me real influence, and with them an offer. The board was prepared to appoint me as CEO if I wanted it. Everything I had been denied was suddenly being placed in front of me. Power, authority, vindication. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, because in that moment I understood something Richard had hoped I would. I no longer needed to return to prove anything. The life I had built did not require permission, titles, or public victories. I had already chosen what mattered, and I was not willing to trade peace for power. People often think revenge is loud. They imagine confrontation, exposure, public humiliation, a dramatic moment where someone finally pays for what they did. That was never my goal. When I said okay that night in my home office, I was not agreeing. I was not surrendering. I was not choosing silence out of fear. I was choosing clarity. Okay meant I saw the truth. Okay meant I understood who Daniel had become and who I could no longer afford to be beside. Okay meant I was done shrinking myself to preserve someone else's sense of power. I did not win by taking anything from him. I won by taking myself out of a system that depended on my silence to survive.
I built a life where my work is judged by its impact, not by who it threatens, where disagreement is not punished, where competence is not inconvenient, where peace is not something I have to negotiate for. That is the part people rarely talk about. Walking away is not weakness when staying would cost you your integrity. Choosing yourself is not selfish when the alternative is slow erosion. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, hear this clearly. You do not need to shout to be powerful. You do not need to destroy to be free. Sometimes the strongest move you can make is a quiet one made with preparation and conviction. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people find stories like this. Share it with someone who might need permission to choose themselves. And tell me in the comments, what would okay mean in your life right now? These are bitter memories, and sometimes the greatest victory is simply living.